Hello, and welcome to this session from the Festive Calendar 2020. My name is Alan Kinane. I'm a technical architect from Dublin, Ireland, and my session is titled Windows Virtual Desktop Christmas Crackers. So what is a Christmas cracker? Well, depending on what part of the world you're from, you may have never heard of these before, but these are something that are very popular in Ireland and the UK and a few other places as well, I believe. A Christmas cracker is something you would normally have around the table during your Christmas dinner. It's basically a cardboard tube that two people will pull between them, one at either end. When you pull it apart, one person will be lucky enough to win the contents inside the Christmas cracker. Those contents include a paper hat, which you would be encouraged to wear while you sit at the table and enjoy your Christmas dinner. There would also be usually terrible Christmas themed joke inside. Sometimes you might also get a trivia question or a tongue twister or something like that, but almost always there would be a very bad joke inside the cracker. And last but not least, you would also receive a small gift, and these are usually small little toys or games that you can play with your family members. So the idea I had for my session was I've just pulled together a collection of operational tips that I've gathered from real customer experiences in the field. I work with a lot of MSPs, and I have a lot of customers who would work with Windows Virtual Desktop, ranging from single user environments to 100 plus users. So I've come across a lot of different environments. So really I've just pulled together a number of kind of best practice tips, cost saving tips, and really just anything that might help you to optimize your already existing Windows Virtual Desktop deployments and get the most out of it. So let's kick off with my first Christmas cracker, my first tip, and talking about the session host's virtual machine size that you will choose. So this is really one of the core decisions you'd have to make when going with Windows Virtual Desktop, which virtual machine size to go with. There are many options, and these options are growing all the time. There are a lot more VM sizes becoming available all the time. But mostly what you'll see from various articles and documentation is to go with the DSV3 size, which is a good general purpose size that will fit most purposes. And that's a good one to go with. No issues with that at all. So I've put that in the first column there, but just alongside it I've put in a few additional options that you may want to consider. The DSV4 has become available more recently, and this is a newer Intel chipset which is supposedly 20% faster than the DSV3 equivalent. It also costs the same price, so that might be something worth considering. The downside to this, however, is that it doesn't have a temporary storage disk on the host, so you won't get that local SSD temp drive, and that's where the page file normally goes. So you'd have to put your page file either on the OS disk or on a separate data disk in this case. One thing to be aware of with this as well is you cannot resize to or from this DSV4 size from a size that has the temp disk. So you can't resize from the DSV3 to the DSV4 or vice versa. That is not possible. So you would have to make this decision at the time of deployment. But it may be worth considering if you just want to get a bit more processing power from your machine for no additional cost. The other one I put alongside this is the DAS-V4 in a different series, that this has the AMD processor instead of an Intel-based processor. Again, it's the same price, so there are similar sizes you can choose here for no extra cost. It's just the processor that's different. But if you look at the ACU there, the Azure Compute Units, you'll see it's actually higher. So the performance from this processor versus the Intel versions there is better, and indeed my feedback from customers that have tried this out is they have found a noticeable performance improvement on this size. So as of right now, at the time of recording, my preferred option would be the DAS-V4. I would recommend that processor for your session hosts. It seems to be the best performing one out of those three, so that's the one I tend to go with. So just choose the correct size within that. The DAS4V4 is the typical size I'd recommend. That's a 4-core 16 gig of RAM size, and that's usually my go-to option. And if you need more, I'd prefer to scale out and just add additional hosts rather than just scaling it up to a larger size. If you do need more RAM, you can go with an EAS family. It's the same chipset, it just has more RAM available per CPU core. So that's an option if you need more RAM. So on to Christmas Cracker number 2 now, and this one is about FSLogix profile size. So no doubt you'll be using FSLogix for your Windows Virtual Desktop user profiles. These are VHD or VHDX files that dynamically expand as you add data to them. So the more files you add to your profile, the more files you create, the more temporary or cache space that you add to your profile, the larger these profile sizes grow. But the important thing to note here is that these grow in size dynamically, but they do not shrink dynamically as data is removed. So if you delete data from your profile, you just end up with empty blocks or wasted space. So there are two methods really to reduce this waste. One method is that you can simply reduce the amount of temporary or cached data that you were storing in the profile in the first place. And the other option is to compact the VHDX file periodically. So that's just a routine maintenance task that you can do. So let's talk about that first method here, reducing the temporary or cache data that you're storing in the profile. So you can configure a redirections.xml file for your FSLogix profiles to exclude any folders that are not required. By default, the temporary folder and the Internet Explorer cache are excluded, so you don't have to worry about those. You can also set your maximum Outlook OST file size. This is worth doing because the few customers I've seen that have gone over their default profile size, the default size is 30 gigabytes. The few customers I've seen that have gone over that, it's almost always down to the OST file for Outlook for users who just have a very, very large OST file. So I would set a maximum size for that. Through your group policy or registry settings or however you prefer to do it. That would be the main culprit for exceeding or hitting your profile size limit, but certainly those cached files, you don't want to store those where possible. So some additional suggestions there would be the Microsoft Teams cache data that can actually chew up a lot of space. And I have an accompanying blog post to this video that has some links for how you can do that. Any cache folders for other web browsers, so I mentioned Internet Explorer is excluded by default, but you may want to exclude Edge, Chrome, Firefox, whatever browsers you want to install on your desktops. And then any line of business applications that you're installing, they may well have cache folders, again temporary space folders that are not persistent data, so you can simply just flush those. So you may well want to just contact your vendors for your line of business applications to see which folders can be excluded from the user cache. Method 2 now is to compact those VHDX files periodically. So this is a manual process and it must be performed offline, so you obviously cannot therefore perform this when the user is logged in and their profile is mounted to a session host. The user would have to be offline, so you'd want to do this out of hours. Simply what this does, it just removes those empty blocks or those wasted space blocks from the VHDX file. And this is something you may well have done in the past with your VHDX files from your Hyper-V hosts perhaps. So easy ways to do this, there are some scripts available. I've put some links on the screen there. There's even a GUI tool option you can use to basically select the profiles. This will basically run the PowerShell commands for you to compact those files and get that space back. So this is a good process you can run maybe a couple of times a year just to get some free space back. And if you've got a large environment, you may well find you get quite a lot of space back because the more users you have, the more wasted space you'll have. So it's just something you can do as part of your managed services just to free up some space and reduce your costs. On to number 3 now, and this is at the time of recording, hot off the press feature. RDP ShortPath has just gone into public preview. So public preview obviously means it's not yet production ready, so definitely something you're going to want to be aware of because this could be a game changer for some of your customers. What this does is it changes your connections from a TCP based connection to a URCP based connection, and this is basically an enhanced version of the UDP protocol. It is a direct connection to your session host, so it bypasses that Microsoft managed Windows Virtual Desktop Gateway service. So instead of going through that gateway, you are now connecting directly to your session hosts. Therefore, that reduces the round trip time and it massively increases the available bandwidth that you would have to your connections. One thing to note here is that this requires a direct connection to your session host. Because you're not going through that Windows Virtual Desktop Gateway, you would need a means to connect directly to your session host. So that's either a public IP address or a VPN or express route. I strongly advise not using the public IP address on your session hosts. Even with NSGs in place, that's really not a very secure option. So you're going to want to use a VPN or an express route if you're going to use this method. But this is a really interesting feature that I know a lot of customers will want to avail of, certainly where latency is an issue for some of their customers. But just remember, at the moment this is in public preview, so by all means check it out, have a look at it, but do not deploy this into production until it goes GA. Number 4 is just a bit more detail on understanding what IOPS and throughput actually mean to your setup. So each individual disk or serverless file share has its own rate limits, as in its own dedicated amount of IOPS and throughput. So if you're using either virtual machine disks for your file shares or your FSLogix profiles, or if you're using a serverless technology such as Azure Files, it's important to know the limitations of these file shares. So because each file share has a dedicated amount of IOPS and throughput, it's a good idea to use different shares for your FSLogix containers and for your regular file shares. So rather than lumping them all onto the same share or onto the same VM disk, use separate disks or separate file shares for those different purposes. For larger environments where you would have multiple host pools, again use separate file shares for those host pools, because if they're all sharing the same file share, they've all got the same amount of IOPS and throughput divided amongst the number of users. If you separate these out logically, you'll get dedicated IOPS and throughput for each file share. If you are using VM disks, you should stripe those into a storage space on Windows. This will actually not only combine the capacity of the disks, but also the IOPS and the throughput will be combined as well, so you'll get much better performance. Now, bear in mind you are limited by the IOPS and throughput that the VM can handle, so make sure you use a decent spec virtual machine. I've seen a lot of people using B series machines as file shares. These will have a very low ceiling of IOPS and throughput, so they'll max out pretty quickly. So unless it's a very small environment, that's probably not really going to hold up for you, so just bear that in mind also. If you're using Azure Files, if you're not using the premium tier, you're using the standard tier, and I know this is quite common as well. As long as you don't require geo-redundant storage, make sure you've enabled large file shares. This allows you to go beyond a 5 terabyte limit up to 100 terabytes of storage, but not only that, it also gives you up to 10,000 IOPS per share. Otherwise you're limited to 1,000 IOPS, so make sure you enable that. Even if you don't need beyond 5 terabytes of storage, it's important to make sure that's enabled to avail of better IOPS. Tip number 5 is to make use of group policy. So right now your session hosts need to be domain joined. Okay, so you've got group policy there that you can use. When you're installing FSLogix, when you download that agent, you will actually get an ADMX template that you can use to configure group policy settings for FSLogix. I'd absolutely recommend you do that. It's the easiest way to set up your FSLogix settings. But make sure you're also setting up your GPO settings for remote desktop services. So a lot of people forget about these. If you've come from an RDS background, you should be familiar with the GPO settings, such as session time limits for idle sessions, disconnected sessions. And this is probably one of my top tips. A lot of people forget to set this up. You got to think like a user. Users tend to not log off properly. They just disconnect their sessions, but they leave everything still up and running. All their applications are still open and still consuming resources on pooled environments. Those are going to, impact other users. So I recommend you sign off those users after they've been disconnected for maybe a couple of hours. It's up to you to configure what setting you want for that, but just sign them off if they haven't been connected for a few hours. Otherwise, they'll just be left open. The same can be said for idle sessions. If a user has been idle on a desktop for many hours, consider maybe just signing them off completely and giving those resources back to the session host. So this is something that's been around since the days of RDS, but still very much applies to Windows Virtual Desktop. So don't forget to set these up. Another one that's useful is loopback processing mode. So if you need to set up some user-based GPO settings that you only want to apply to those users when they're on the session hosts, i.e. you don't want them to apply to their main machines in the office or their laptops or whatever. If you just want those to kick in just for the users when they're on the session host, you have to enable loopback processing mode. It's something I discovered many years ago that was a complete game changer for me personally. So have a look for that if you haven't come across it before. And just a small tip here to finish, set the customer's corporate logo as the background wallpaper. You'd be amazed how much customers love this. They just get a real kick out of it when they see their logo splashed on the background when a user logs in. Again, something very easy to set up with the likes of group policy. It's a small tip, but it does go a long way. Number 6 is image management. So I recommend maintaining a golden image for each of your host pools, and then you can use the shared image gallery. It's a good way just to manage those images anyway, but certainly if you're using multiple Azure regions, it's a really handy way to distribute your images to other regions by replicating those images directly into other regions automatically. It's really handy. This image should be updated probably 3 or 4 times a year after major OS updates, feature releases or any big application updates you do. And always remember to install the latest FSLogix agent when you're doing this update. So that agent seems to be updated maybe 2 or 3 times a year, and it's very important to keep that up to date because you'll get new features, performance improvements, bug fixes, etc. So just remember to keep that up to date and make sure you've got the same version running on all of your session hosts. Don't mix and match the versions. That's why if you're using a golden image, make sure you just have the agent, the latest version installed on your golden image. This image then can be quickly used to add or redeploy session hosts. So that actually means you don't need to back up your session host. Remember, the data, the user data, is in the FSLogix profiles, which is stored on remote storage somewhere else, so either on Azure Files or maybe on a disk on another machine. It's not on the actual session host machine. So realistically, you shouldn't really need to back up the session host. Just maintain an image. You can very quickly redeploy from that image then. And just a bit more on this one then. So when you're doing your updates, make your updates, your changes to the golden image, so not directly to the production session host, just to the image itself. When you're ready to replace them then, so put your existing session hosts into drain mode, wait for all the users to log off, then deallocate those machines. I would say don't delete the machines just yet. Leave them for at least a couple of days. So they're still there in the host pool, but they are deallocated and in drain mode. So after you've added your new session hosts in, you can see how they perform for the first few days. If there's any issues at all, if users are having problems, performance related or software related, if things aren't working, because you haven't removed your original session hosts, you can very quickly swap them back in again. And then go again when you've made your changes. Finally, I'd always recommend retaining at least the last 2 image versions in your shared image gallery. So keep the last 2 versions at least, just so again you can roll back if you need to, if there's any issues. Cracker number 7 now, securing your sessions. So if you're on the ARM-based version, the Spring Update release of Windows Virtual Desktop, make sure you're using conditional access. So conditional access can be used with the current version of Windows Virtual Desktop. You should already be using multi-factor authentication for your Microsoft 365 sign-in, so this can very easily be extended to Windows Virtual Desktop as well, including the Windows client. So it's not just for the web client, it can be used for the Windows desktop client also. You could consider using trusted locations, and this may not apply when users are working from home because it's very difficult to manage, especially with dynamic IP address assignments and so on. But if users are based, in the office all the time, this can be useful as well to improve security. Or use trusted devices. So if you're using Intune to manage your devices, you can make sure those devices are trusted and compliant in order to use this service. Again, very easy to set this up with conditional access. Don't forget about the group policy we spoke about earlier to further secure your session host, just the various security settings you can enforce with group policy. So just a quick example there, lock the screen after an idle period. Remember, this is going to apply to the remote session, not their local machine, but it's still a good security tip to make sure the screen gets locked after an idle period of time. And then you can always take this a step further and implement either Azure Firewall or a third-party virtual firewall appliance to make your environment even more secure. Number 8 is all about monitoring. I always say if you're a managed service provider, if you're not monitoring, then you're not managing. You have to monitor your session host performance. Otherwise, you're just going to get a phone call or an email from your customer complaining that something's wrong. So you have to be proactive about this stuff. So first thing I do is I install the VM Insights agent onto your session hosts. That'll capture that information, ingest that performance and diagnostic information into a log analytics workspace, and then you can use workbooks to visualize that performance. There are many free workbook examples for Windows Virtual Desktop available from the online community. Just have a search for it. I've put some links up on my accompanying blog post for this video, so check those out also. And the first 5 gigabytes of data ingested into Log Analytics is free every month. So this may not even cost you anything. And if it does, it's probably going to be a very small amount, but absolutely worth it because you really should be performing this service for your customers. Number 9 is one I've included because it still amazes me how many people get this wrong and don't know how to set up domain controllers correctly in a virtual environment. So the Active Directory database and sysvol folders should not be stored on the OS disk. OS disks in Azure are configured with a read-write level cache, and that should not be changed. It's set like that for performance reasons. And if you set up your Active Directory domain services and just put that database on the C drive, you're putting it on a cached disk, and that can lead to bad things. Active Directory database corruptions, USN rollbacks, and a whole world of pain that you do not want to have to go with. There's a very, very easy way to get around this, and that's just adding a separate data disk and making sure the host caching is set to none. And that's where you put your NTDS and sysvol folders. And that can be a very small disk. You can get a standard SSD disk as little as 4 gigabytes nowadays, which I think is something less than, I think it's about 50 cents a month or something like that. So it's not going to cost you really anymore, and it'll save you potentially a lot of pain later on down the line. So just when you're setting up your domain controllers, make sure to add in a data disk, and make sure when you're installing Active Directory domain services that you're pointing the database at that data disk, not the OS disk. On to number 10 now, and this is another public preview feature that was just announced at the time of recording. This is Azure Files SMB Multichannel. So your Windows client machines will be using the SMB 3.0 protocol to access file shares. So again, if you take the example of your FSLogix file share, if you're putting that on Azure Files on the premium tier, right now that will be using just a single channel to access that file share. But this new feature will allow you to actually use 4 channels instead of the 1. That will give you higher throughput, increased IOPS, and better fault tolerance. And the good thing is this doesn't cost you any more. So this is going to be a no-brainer, again, because this is a preview feature. You have to opt into it, and it's not recommended for production use just yet. But this will be something that you'll definitely want to enable once it goes into general availability. I'm not quite sure if it'll be turned on by default or it's something you have to enable or not. But again, this is just something that you're going to want to be aware of and going to want to enable once it goes into GA. Number 11 is just my tips on FSLogix configurations that I've pulled together from articles and speaking to customers and seeing what works best. So make sure, first of all, that you are using dynamically expanding VHDX files for your user profiles, not the VHD format. You'll get more options with VHDX. The default size or maximum size for FSLogix is 30 gigabytes. So because it's dynamically expanding, it's going to grow and grow until it reaches a maximum of that 30 gigabyte size. You might think that's enough, but you should consider increasing that. I have seen customers go over that, as I mentioned before, usually down to that OST file being massive. So you may want to consider just increasing that maximum size limit, but do set a reasonable maximum size. You don't want it to be completely out of control. Just bear in mind that the default size is 30 gigs if you don't specify anything. This is a popular one. I know a lot of you will be aware of this, but essential to set up, I think. Enable, if you're using group policy, it's called a swap directory name components. You'll see that in the GPO object for FSLogix. If you're using a registry setting, it's called flip-flop profile directory name. So make sure that feature is enabled. What that does is it appends the username to the FSLogix profile. If you don't enable this, the profile will just be named after the user SID. So if you end up with a corrupt user profile, it's just extra work trying to figure out the correct profile name if you don't have the actual username appended to that. So a very simple thing to do, but could save you a lot of time down the road. Enable delete local profile when FSLogix profile should apply. I recommend this for new environments because if you have a local user profile on the session host, that is what will get picked up when the user signs in. It won't be the FSLogix profile. What this setting does, it will delete any local profiles. So if you're doing any testing or anything, this is a nice way to tidy up those local profiles so they get deleted when the user first logs in. If you have an existing environment out there, just be very cautious if you're using this, because if you are using local profiles as opposed to hosted on another file share, they will get deleted if you turn this on. But something I would recommend enabling for new environments, certainly. And this last one is it's a registry key only at the moment, I believe. This is a new feature that just got released very recently in the most recent FSLogix agent. This is clean up invalid sessions. So sometimes what can happen is if a user gets disconnected or terminated from a session in an inelegant manner, sometimes that profile can be locked, and they'll find when they try and log in again, they may have issues accessing their profile, or it may create a temporary local profile or something like that. So what this setting will actually do is it will actually release the lock on that profile so the user can sign in again. And I have seen a few customers affected by this issue for various different reasons, but this is just a setting you can configure that will prevent this from happening and allow the user to log in as normal. So again, make sure you're keeping your FSLogix agents up to date, and do read the documentation when they update that, because this is how I became aware of this setting, just by reading the notes with that new agent. So on to Christmas cracker number 12 now, which is ephemeral OS disks. This is something that I've blogged about in the past. It's a really interesting feature that I like quite a lot. This is useful for non-persistent or stateless desktops. So if you're using pooled host pools, this may be something you can consider to use to optimize your machines and save on some cost. But this would not be useful for personal desktops where you're actually saving data directly to the session hosts. So with virtual machines with ephemeral OS disks, they actually can't be stopped and started. That's not actually possible. So if you're intending to use automation to deallocate your machines outside of business hours, this is not something for you. But if the machines are always on, if you were to restart that machine, it would actually get re-imaged. So any data that you would have put onto the virtual machine OS disk will actually be wiped, and the machine will be re-imaged again, re-provisioned from that base image. But that's usually fine with non-persistent desktops, because remember, all the user data, the user profile, is contained in an FSLogix profile on remote storage. It's not actually kept on the session host itself. So this makes this a viable option in some cases. And one of the main advantages of ephemeral OS disks is it actually uses the local SSD storage on the same physical host as the virtual machine. So it does dramatically improve the performance of the disk because it's local to the same host. The latency is therefore brought way down. And the other good thing is that it's completely free. So this is actually included in the cost of the virtual machine itself. You do not have to pay for the OS disk. So if you have a customer with a lot of session hosts, maybe into the dozens or hundreds even, if you think of all the OS disks that you have to factor into your cost there, if they were now suddenly free, this can have a dramatic impact on your monthly costs. So again, this is something not for everyone, but in certain circumstances you may well find this is a viable option, and it could make a dramatic cost difference to your customer and improve the performance of the actual OS disk as well at the same time. That's it from me. I hope everybody found that useful and maybe picked up one or two nuggets of information. Again, just a collection of tips I've put together from speaking with Windows Virtual Desktop customers over the last year or so. I do have a blog, azureallen.ie, and I have an accompanying blog post to this video with some useful links that will delve into each of those tips in a little bit more detail. Do connect with me on Twitter, and I'm on LinkedIn as well if you want to connect with me that way as well. With that, I just want to thank Richard and Gregor for putting together the Festive Calendar 2020. I'm delighted to have been a part of it again this year. It's bigger and better this year, and I'm sure it'll be bigger and better again next year. And I'd just finally like to finish up and wish everyone happy holidays or a happy Christmas. And let's all hope next year is a better one. So happy New Year. Here's to a good 2021. And take care. See ya.